So I like to always get a sense of what people know and what they don't know. So hands, how many people had ever heard of Flo Kennedy?
Only because of your book.
Okay, well keep them up, wait, and not from me. Okay, now this is more what I'm used to. It's like hands are up. So with that, don't feel bad. I hadn't heard of Flo Kennedy until, gosh, I was in grad school at Cornell, and I'd already been a women's studies minor at Spelman College. I'd been an out feminist for years, out black feminist for years. Had never heard of Flo Kennedy until I was in grad school several years later. And I was watching TV, and she comes running across the screen, and she's yelling at Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who I knew who he was. And she's calling him a racist, sexist bastard, and he's trying to get away from her, and I'm thinking, because I realized this was old footage, who is this woman who's not being arrested? How is she even getting to be near him? I had all these questions, and luckily a friend sitting next to me, and I write about this a little bit in my introduction, said, oh, that's Flo Kennedy, and she's dead, and she's a feminist. And that was back in '96, and she wasn't dead at the time, but the internet wasn't how it is now, so I couldn't just Google her. So I went and I looked in the Black Women's Encyclopedia. Some people, there's 2 volumes that had just come out recently, and there was a little entry on Flo Kennedy, and it said she was still alive, but still I had no way of kind of knowing. And at that point, I'd started my kind of interest. Really, at that point, I was doing 19th century. I was a 19th century historian. Didn't really understand what the 20th century historians did. And I just started that as a hobby. I really didn't think you could, for the graduate students, the younger graduate students here, I didn't think you could study things you liked. But I know, I thought it has to be esoteric and hard to figure out, to be interesting. And so Flo Kennedy became really a hobby for years. And so I started collecting Color Me Flo, which was kind of this short memoir that she had, if you could even call it that. It was a coffee table book. Started collecting just anything that had her name on it, going to used bookstores looking for things, and now I'm starting to see her name everywhere. Even though I had read Assata Shakur's autobiography, I now noticed there's Flo Kennedy's name in it. She was her lawyer. So now I'm starting to notice her everywhere, but still, it was just a hobby. So I want you guys to kind of see, I'm going to show you a little video clip. This isn't that video of her chasing Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, but this will give you a sense of why I was so captivated. This is from 60 Minutes.
These are supposed to be the silent 70s. No more massive protests, rioting, or fiery rhetoric of the left. The country is more or less at peace with itself and the rest of the world. Well, there are some people who are never at peace. Professional, full-time, instinctive gadflies. Such a gadfly is this person, Florynce Kennedy, who calls herself Old Black Flo, and is ready to take on the establishment at the drop of one of the many outrageous hats she wears. Whether it's championing blacks or women or homosexuals or prostitutes, Flo is out there with her verbal brickbats attacking.
You cannot have reverse discrimination until we catch up. Until black people have lynched as many white people as white people have lynched black people. Until women have raped as many men as men have raped women. Until women and black people and homosexuals and farm workers and domestic workers and handicapped people and old people and kids have been able to be in charge of discrimination to the same degree that the people who keep them out.
Outrage is Florynce Kennedy's stock in trade. Outrage over minority rights. It's a commodity or talent that can pay big dividends. For Flo Kennedy, $60,000 or $70,000 a year on the national lecture circuit. A lot of it is poured right back into her favorite causes. Her clothes match her personality. Outrageous. Here she wears her coyote skin coat, and she's a supporter of a group called Coyote, an association of prostitutes. Coyote is an acronym for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics.
Happy birthday to me! Happy birthday to me!
And so, on her birthday, heavily attended by New York's radical chic crowd,
Did you see what Sherie gave me? Isn't it fabulous? I can't get over it. It's so beautiful.
Flo trots out her defense of prostitutes with a little ditty.
Everybody needs a hooker once in a while.
Her defense of prostitution is carried to the young minds of America. Brown University.
How dare a government make criminal the one activity that you can do without more than a modicum of training, and which brings a larger revenue, which many women have chosen to go into. What am I going to say? They're bad women. I don't care what feminists say about whores. I wish you'd hear what some of the whores say about the feminists.
So you could see why I was captivated by this woman and thought, whoa, who is this black woman? And often, what's so interesting is you can see in 1976, 60 Minutes did a special on her. I mean, if you did just a JSTOR, ProQuest search, you see the New York Times, the Village Voice, they mention her more than Shirley Chisholm in that time period. So she's the most well-known, you could argue, black feminist of her time period, but yet, she's been forgotten in this time period. Let me move on. So this is the cover of her, of Color Me Flo, and this is a quote that she often said in various forms. My main message is that we have a pathologically, institutionally racist, sexist, classist society, and that niggerizing techniques that are used don't only damage black people, but they also damage women, gay people, ex-prison inmates, prostitutes, children, old people, handicapped people, Native Americans. And if we can begin to analyze the pathology of oppression, we would learn a lot about how to deal with it. And she was saying this in understanding herself as a black feminist as early as '67, using the word black feminist. So she understood herself as a black feminist much sooner than that, but using kind of this definition, this intersectional definition. So Flo Kennedy understood that despite various institutional forms of oppression people suffered, they were ultimately more powerful than the forces aligned against them. She reasoned if larger and larger numbers of people realized that their exploitation was linked, they would eventually begin in the radical process of revolutionary change. Through an activist career that spanned in more than 50 years. So Flo Kennedy was born in 1916 in Kansas City, Missouri. She's active. I argue she's active even when she's kind of in grade school, but a political career where she's considering herself an activist and very active, moving to New York, spanning 50 years up until she's really has to stay in a wheelchair in his home, but even then she's making flyers and so forth. But throughout that career, Kennedy targeted the connection between racism, sexism, imperialism, and other forms of oppression. Kennedy's activism demonstrated the central role of black feminists in post-World War II social and political movements. She worked in civil rights, New Left, Black Power. She's most often thought of, for those of you who didn't know of her through me, she's most often thought of as the black feminist who worked with white feminists. Yes, that's how we know of her. And in fact, they put her on the map. That's how we know her best, and that's where you see the greatest media coverage from her is through white feminist press and white feminist protests. She moved fluidly, but what I kind of talk about in my book, not kind of what I argue, is that she moves fluidly between movements. And she's not influenced just by white feminists, but she is really influencing white feminism. And now sometimes it's ignored, her advice is ignored, sometimes her influence is taken, sometimes her theories are used, but she's at the forefront of trying to develop a predominantly white feminist movement. During the 1960s and 70s, Kennedy was well known to the media and other activists, but again, my book and some articles I've read are the first scholarly work on her. So contrary to historical representation and popular belief, black feminists, as members and founders of mostly white feminist organizations and founders of an independent black feminist organization and movements, attempted to shift the mainstream women's movement away from a single focus on gender-based oppression. Studies of independent black feminists and predominantly white feminist movements accurately cite the increased masculinity that kept feminism and black power divided. So that's the story that we normally hear. That is one story that There's so much sexism in Black power, there's so much sexism in the New Left, that causes the rise of both Black feminism and predominantly white feminism, or second wave feminism. I push back against that, and I'll talk a little bit about that today. So they're not so wrong to do so, but positioning Black power as only an antagonistic force misses how women's liberation leaders and members understood liberation and revolution. So totally ignoring or under-examining the influence of Black feminists within the mostly white feminist organizations leaves feminist literature with the misconception that second-wave feminism was led and founded only by white women. Indeed, Kendi's history forces us to recognize the Black power movement's central role in shaping radical feminisms, both Black and white. The connections that Kendi forged between Black power advocates and emerging white feminists provided feminists with a vocabulary for describing gender and racial oppression and fueled the creation of broad-based anti-racist alliances. So let's move forward. So for some of you who aren't as familiar with her, I want to just give you a sense of some of the organizations she was a founding member or an early member of. So Wednesdays in Mississippi is, I argue in the book, is a civil rights organization, and now there's actually a lot of good articles coming out on Wednesdays in Mississippi. The Media Workshop, I describe as a Black Power organization, which she's the founder of. Now, the October 17th movement, the Feminist Party, which supports Shirley Chisholm's bid for presidency. She's a founder of the National Black Feminist Organization, the Committee for the Benign Neglect of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, another Black feminist organization, WARN, Women Against Richard Nixon. So a lot of these organizations are very well known and still exist, like NOW. She's an early founding member of the New York chapter of NOW. And some of them only existed and only had her as a member, or had very few members. But Flo Kennedy was really adept at creating organizations and making it seem like she had this broad alliance of people fighting against whatever issue. She also is a lawyer. She went to Columbia Law School. She went to Columbia for undergrad. She's a lawyer for Billie Holiday and Charlie Parker. I argue this in the book, and actually when I first started this project, Robin Kelly was my advisor, and he was working on a biography on Monk, and I would interview people, and they assumed I was writing on Flo Kennedy as a jazz musician's lawyer, because that's how they knew her, and especially in New York City. So they'd say, oh, did Monk have some involvement with Flo Kennedy? And I was like, oh, I don't know, what do you think? You tell me. So she's Billie Holiday's lawyer. She often, and this happens a lot with women, both Black and white, they're estate lawyers because that's not a lot of court time, and so they get relegated into this behind the scenes role. So she does a lot of estate work, but she also does work actually in the courtroom on behalf of Billie Holiday. There's cabaret laws that kind of relegate them to not being able to perform in major venues in New York City because of drug addiction. And so Flo is helpful with her in trying to not get jail time because of that. She also becomes, and that's in the 50s, early 60s, that she's working with jazz musicians, writers. She becomes very informed and very adept in the 50s when she's a lawyer, through jazz musicians, through writers, also about consumer rights. So if you think of, say, soap operas, how they come about, right? A soap opera actually comes about because they want to sell soap. So they create TV shows to do just that. Flo figures this out, and she's like, wait, that's ridiculous. So our TV shows, music, so forth, are being created by advertisers, big companies. So why are we protesting CBS? Let's protest Tide. And so she becomes really adept at thinking those things through, but this is also in the moment where there is no entertainment law. So she's using that term, and people think she's crazy. She's using that term like, how do we understand copyright when it doesn't apply to the written page? How do we understand copyright when it's music, when it's a TV program, so forth? And so in the 50s and 60s, she's playing with that with very little success at sometimes. By the time we get to the 60s, she's a lawyer working with Kunstler, if people can recognize him, and different lawyers, putting them in touch with each other to really, and I was looking through, have people been through that exhibit over there? I just went through it really quickly about the beats, and they actually had a lot of the wording that I kind of use and a lot of the theory that's in my book, where actually what mostly these lawyers, how they made their money is defending men who didn't want to go away to war, yes, and who were political. That's how they made most of their money, but then they were able to then defend Black Panthers and so forth for free because of that work. And so she does a lot of that work and a lot of that theorization. Here, people know who this is, H. Rap Brown. So she's a lawyer for H. Rap Brown. She's a lawyer for the Panther 21. She's a lawyer for Assata Shakur. So she's a very central lawyer in the Black Power movement. She defends him on charges that he started a riot, and then he's put up on charges for being on a plane carrying a gun, even though he legally could do that. But then he was brought up on charges while he's in the air and arrested. But no one inciting a riot, no one's killed during this or what have you, but I just want you to notice how he's being treated. And then, do people know who this is? This is Valerie Solanas. So she's the white feminist who shot Andy Warhol in the late 60s. She's being arrested here. Do you notice how she's being treated? No cuffs. He's actually cuffed on his feet as well. He shoots no one. And so I put these side by side in my book, but this is also something that Flo Kennedy, as she's very active, and I'll talk about this, as she's active in both the Black Power and the predominantly white feminist movement, she's very much aware on the different ways that racism work and the ways in which Black and brown people are treated by the police and by the state. And she makes that very clear when she's also talking to white feminists, that who's being antagonized in certain political moments, or she would say, where's the knife being sharpened first? But that didn't matter, because she would also say, if you have a toothache or you have a heart attack, in that moment, they're both very painful. And so everyone needs to form an alliance together. But she was very much aware of the different ways the media and also the state treated Black men as opposed to white feminists. Okay. Lastly, in terms of being a lawyer, she's a lawyer for the major case in New York that legalizes abortion. That becomes the test case, or one of the cases rolled up to Roe v. Wade. So she helps to put together the legal team for that, and actually the process, which when I teach about this to my students, they think this is ridiculous. Before this case, you didn't use women as the people making the complaint, the plaintiffs. You would use doctors or even clergy. I know, and it seems my students were like, how could that be? Who else would bring the case about? But the argument would be made before that doctors couldn't actually be doctors and give the correct prescription because of abortion laws. In this case, they actually are that women aren't free to actually make choices. That's a new political argument that is being pushed back against at that time. But Flo, and they use some Black women, and I'll talk about that, but using women and their voices and their actual life experiences. All right, and I could have chosen any page. This is a page from Flo Kennedy's FBI record that has hundreds of pages in it. This is from '68, and as you can see, in one day, in a course of a month, she goes to the Socialist Workers' Party meeting, she goes to a Communist Party meeting, Black anti-draft, Jeanette Rankin Brigade, which I would describe as a predominantly white feminist anti-war organization. So she's traveling within all of these organizations, sometimes joining them, oftentimes not joining, not a card-carrying member. And when she goes to these meetings, the FBI is very confused. At certain points, they're like, is she stealing from them? Like, this woman is jumping all over the place. Like, she did this fundraiser, but did she keep the $20? They're not sure, so they're asking people, please report back about the $5. They're not sure what she's doing, and plus she's dramatically older than a lot of these people at certain points. So they're like, why is she hanging around with 17 and 16-year-olds and 19-year-olds and SNCC? So there's much confusion about who she is and why is she so politically promiscuous. There must be some hustle to it. So they couldn't understand what I say is her Black feminism and her Black feminist politics that can't just be satisfied in one political space. So in 1966, so I'm going to move backwards, I mentioned the Media Workshop as a Black Power organization that she founded. Very much, at this point, she's heavily within her legal career. She identifies primarily as a lawyer. In 1966, the call for Black Power gets a lot of media attention. It's already going on. She says this all the time. Black Power had already existed without the title. But in '66, it gained some traction in the media, and she attends the first Black Power conference held by Adam Clayton Powell, and she starts the Media Workshop to kind of mirror and support this. She says the Media Workshop intends to harness sufficient Black power to make a meaningful protest against the high cost of Jim Crow advertising and the segregated media. She wants to make Black power a reality. So some of the early members, does this picture look familiar to people? The one with Gloria Steinem? And oftentimes we see this picture, it's very popular, especially Women's History Month. Does anyone know who that Black woman next to her is? No, right? It's like, who is she? But Dorothy Pittman Hughes, and there's actually a woman at University of Massachusetts who's now writing a biography on her, because she's very active in this moment. Dorothy Pittman Hughes, who's just Dorothy Pittman at that point, she started cooperative daycares in New York. She also started what she argues, and I would argue that she's probably correct in that, one of the first places for abused women to go to in Harlem to get safety. The other woman up top is Florynce Rice. She's an early member in this moment. And there's also Black men members who are union representatives, there are people from the Communist Party, there's white women members. So Flo Kennedy clearly sees Black power as something that is interracial, that has an interracial connections, but it's a united front. And again, looking at that Beats exhibit, it kind of mirrors that in some ways. You see the wording of united front. And those of you who have read about the Panthers, they use this language a lot too, this united front that puts, to attack fascism. Even if you're not a card-carrying member of whatever organization, you all could come together to defeat what Flo would say is racism. All right. So in '67, she's already a member. In '66, she's already a member and understanding Black power, going to Black power meetings. In the same moment, she's also helping to form the National Organization of Women. And this is their first protest in New York. She's at the very first meeting. They think she's a lunatic. At that meeting, set up very similar to this. Rows, they're all sitting there in rows. She puts up her hand every single time to say, well, what are you gonna do about the war? What are you gonna do about the Vietnam War? What are you gonna do about Black power? And of course, Betty Friedan is like, this lunatic woman, we're starting a women's movement. Why do you think, that this is what this meeting is about? And she keeps putting up her hand and saying that over and over again, that these things need to be connected, because she sees a women's movement as a leg in that battle. With Black power as the vanguard. She still thinks very much in terms of vanguard. Intersection, but Black power and anti-racism being what unites. So she's at this first protest. That's Catherine Stimson. She's the dean. She's the founder of Signs, the journal. That's T. Grace Atkinson, and Kate Millett is behind them, and they're protesting sex-segregated New York Times ads, where ads, they're ads for women. They would say, these are the jobs for women, these are the jobs for men, and they're arguing that all the jobs should just be together. You shouldn't say if it's a director of a firm that's for a man. And so they were really successful, and that's their first successful protest, and it gets a lot of media attention. Simultaneously, she's also part of the Black Power Conference. She helps to organize their media. She's with Mary Baraka, who formerly of the Beats, who's Leroy Jones. He's one of the founders of it. Stokely Carmichael's an early member. And it's kind of not an interracial, it's a united front of various political actors, but mostly to kind of understand Black power. At this meeting, This is Queen Mother Moore. At this meeting in Newark in '67, it's right after the Newark Rebellion. She's leading a workshop on the media, because that's really where she comes in. She's with Ossie Davis. She's leading this meeting, and she's talking about the media and so forth. Queen Mother Moore stands up and she says, "Who are these white women in the back?" People turn around to see that Flo Kennedy had invited young women from NOW. So she had invited T. Grace Atkinson and Peg Brennan, who then one was a graduate student at Columbia. They were in their mid-20s. They're in the back of the room. Everyone gets upset because this is supposed to be a meeting for all black people. Flo says, "I invited them and they're going to stay." Everyone gets upset. Queen Mother Moore, who I don't talk about this as much in the book because some of these interviews were given to me off the record. Queen Mother Moore and her were actually good friends. And Queen Mother Moore would actually come to her for advice about how to get women in the Black Power movement abortions. But then in meetings would be against abortion, which would make sense because your politics, in the face of things, it's genocide, but behind closed doors, the reality is, what do you do with these issues? But she's chastising Flo Kennedy, and they're threatening to kill the women of NOW. Peg Brennan runs off. She's like, forget this, I'm leaving. Flo commands T. Grace Atkinson to stay. She says, "Stay where you are." T. Grace stays because Flo's her mentor. She begins to look at her feet. Flo is able to get the meeting to kind of calm down. She goes back with Ossie Davis, continues to kind of give her report about the state of Black power and how she thinks they can attack the media. And T. Grace listens to that meeting, to that workshop. She leaves afterwards. And what she says is, in that moment, she sees a movement in transition. And what she meant by that, it's moving from civil rights to Black power. And she said in that moment, she felt the wind on her back. She thought, wow, how do you do this? And that's what Flo wanted her to see. People are coming up with delegates. They're planning strategy. This is how it's done. How are you going to do it in your alleged women's movement? Because Flo would put air quotes. What is this women's movement you speak of? Because in this moment, there is no women's movement. There are women's organizations, but there's no movement. So T. Grace is taking all this in, and she goes back to NOW. She goes back to NOW, this is in '67, and she says, we're going to have a Women in Black Power meeting. We're going to invite many people from the Black Power Conference. So they invite Nathan Wright, they invite Betty Shabazz. As just a side note, I talk about this briefly in the book, not a lot. Flo Kennedy also serves, she's the godmother to Betty Shabazz's children, two of Betty Shabazz's children, and she once Malcolm X is killed, she helps to fundraise and do a lot of that legwork and now we know much more about that. So we know the house that they lived in was owned by the Nation of Islam. We know that that whole block was Nation of Islam, right? That whole area was Nation of Islam where they lived. And she didn't want to leave her home, so they had to get her a new home. They had to do all these things. Flo Kennedy led that up, and she becomes very close with her. And in that moment, Betty Shabazz is invited through Flo Kennedy's connections, Omar Ahmed, who's also of the Black Power Conference, Verda Mae Smart Grosvenor, who I define as a Black Power leader. You could also say she's also Black feminist, and Flo serves as kind of the moderator. So you can imagine how this meeting goes. Those historical actors, Betty Friedan is there, and various people. So the young people, the younger feminists, which we would call radical feminists now, like T. Grace Atkinson, Kate Millett, Osama Diallo, are very interested in this conversation because they're hearing it not just from Flo Kennedy, but throughout the media, throughout their other conversations in New York. But these are the notes, and this is directly out of NOW's papers. These are the notes how the administration of NOW, the senior people, thought about that meeting. So they say that Omar Ahmed, the whole equivalent of his talk are, "You are oppressing me," and you see how that's spelled, kind of a bastardized thinking of Black language. Then they say it's an insane speech. Eve and Adam, Blacks should have babies until they equal white pop. White women really envy Black women's hairstyles. That's the sum of it. And then with Verda Mae Smart Grosvenor, the secretary wrote, "Did she come? Weren't you there?" And this kind of underscores really who the women in Now, the senior women in Now, and also the leadership in Now, who they thought were leaderships in Black power. So you don't even realize if Black women are speaking, because they're not really a part of Black power. And Flo Kennedy's voice isn't made note of, and so forth. And what you think of the Black men is kind of written out in kind of this bastardized way. What's so interesting about this, and what's also interesting about this, anytime I do an interview, everyone remembers this meeting. Like they were like, whoa, that was crazy. Whoa, that was different for us. Also, some of the things that happened, which people universally kind of agreed about in interviews, are that Omar Ahmed especially, he asked a question, and a fairly sexist question, but he asked a question. He said, what's your uniform? I'm looking out on you. You got these mini skirts on, it's tight jeans. I don't get it. So what are you doing? So obviously, everyone, both young and old, radical and liberal, they're offended by that question. He said, but in Black power, he continues, in Black power, we're thinking about our uniform. You know, Omar Ahmed was also in The Nation, so he was like, in The Nation, we wear, you know, we dress a certain way to present a certain attitude. So what's your uniform? Black power, these are ways, sneak peek, what's your uniform? And obviously, many people are offended by that because he was obviously making sexist judgment of their miniskirts. But T. Grace Atkinson said she left there thinking, what is our uniform? What have we even thought about what our uniform is in terms of a women's movement, if we were to have one, and so forth? What is our vocabulary? Do we have those skills? Do we have to think all of that out? And is that different than what Now is saying we should be about? So these are conversations that are starting to be had with Flo Kennedy's prompting. Now, as you can imagine, and I'm fast forwarding a lot, this connection to Black power isn't going to last very long. Flo continues to have arguments. Her influence over younger, radical white feminists does not last long. She's one of the few Black feminists who's working in that chapter. We know Shirley Chisholm and Pauli Murray, but they're not active and they don't come often. So her influence is direct and constant. And she resigns. By 1968, she resigns. And white feminists who write about this, and even T. Grace who writes about this, write about it incorrectly. Because in the moment, T. Grace decides to write about this and say she left with a group of young women. They're so upset because now racism, sexism, so forth, that they leave. And she erases Flo Kennedy from that story. And she forgets this, so when I'm interviewing, she's like, that's not true. And I'm like, you have a whole book where you talk about it. So I don't know what to say to you. I didn't have to look far. It's in Amazon Odyssey. You wrote a whole letter saying you left with a cadre of young women. The fact is she didn't leave with anyone but Flo Kennedy, who was 54 at the time. Now, why not talk about Flo Kennedy? Why not say she left with Flo Kennedy, that she was the only one to resign with her? I think in retrospect, that would mean still she was following Flo Kennedy's directive, that she was being mentored by a Black woman. And she wanted to model really what she then goes on to create in this whole escape from liberal white feminists, from Betty Friedan. She wanted to model that over SNCC and what the SNCC SCLC rift. So the younger women are bumping heads with the older women. And that is the case, but the fact is she left with a Black feminist who's actually incubating those ideas and actually respecting her ideas. And later other women leave, but in that moment she's the only one to leave. And so Flo writes this letter about her resignation, and she writes it publicly. This is to formalize my resignation as of October 17th, 1968, from the National and New York Now, and the last straw, which resulted in my assuming an informally inactive status, was a racist remark of the national president, Betty Friedan, in an executive committee meeting at the home of Shep and Mariel Fox Arneson, demanding that I focus my attention on matters of Black power and not dare interfere with the public relations of Now. So clearly, the leadership, people like Betty Friedan, people like Mariel Fox, saw her as Black power, as promoting Black power. They didn't see it and often said, you are not a feminist. And Flo rejected that. She's like, my feminism is a Black feminism, and it connects all of these movements. So when she leaves, when Flo Kennedy leaves with T. Grace Atkinson, and again, T. Grace forgot about this. So, you know, it's funny, historians remind their historical actors. This was hidden in the New York Times. So I was able to find this. T. Grace remembers leaving again, leaving alone. And she forgets in that moment, she actually is using Flo Kennedy's words. She said, the dissident members of National Organization for Women have organized the young, the black, the beautiful into a new group called the October 17th Movement. Now, this sounds crazy. The young, the black, the beautiful. The beautiful are white women. The young is the student movement, and the black is Black Power. But we got to work through that. But she sees this again in the way that Flo Kennedy is teaching and influencing as alliance building. She continues, the new organization will be an action coalition of the student movement, the women's movement, and the Negro movement. Again, that kind of underscores Flo Kennedy's idea that any movement, that the women's movement is set up to be really what we would now consider a black feminist movement. So even though this organization is predominantly white, it should have a black feminist politics. And in the beginning, it actually has not just Flo Kennedy, but other black women that Flo brings to it. Kay Lindsay, who's a producer at WBAI and also a poet. If you've had a copy of The Black Woman, she has poetry that's in there, and I believe an essay. She joins, but very quickly within the year, as the women's liberation movement takes shape, T. Grace changes. The women in the organization, especially younger white women in the organization, want the organization to go a different direction, to start critiquing masculinity in ways that Flo Kennedy doesn't agree with, use the language of, so say Black Power used the language of kill whitey at times. They wanted to use the language of kill men, and Flo Kennedy was against that. She said that doesn't translate in the same way. And she did not believe in organizations just having, as you can see in Black Power, she brought white women to the Black Power conference. So she didn't believe in feminist organizations not having men in it. So she very much pushed back. And this is a moment where white feminists are playing with these ideas. And so Flo Kennedy eventually leaves, but respects them enough to still attend their events. But she eventually leaves out of those kind of ideological differences. So, all right, I want to end right about here because I want to give us some time for some questions. So most histories assume that white feminists had no direct connection with Black Power. In fact, if you read some articles, with the exception of mine and some of the stuff that came out by Stephen Ward and so forth, people would just say they had it in the ethos. Like, they were reading Rat, or they were reading these kind of things, and they heard it in the ethos. And really what I try to show in the book is it's not in the ethos. There's a direct connection that's being made by black feminists like Flo Kennedy that's trying to directly change the white feminist movement. And it's not, it's purposeful, and it didn't have to have so many racist glitches. There was an opportunity for it to be more intersectional. So the story of how the mostly white radical feminist movement was directly influenced by Black Power and black feminist Flo Kennedy helps us to move black feminism and Black Power out from the margins of second wave feminist movement history and closer to its center. While the October 17th movement would later change its name to the Feminists and lose much of its anti-racist agenda and thus all of its black feminist membership, its origins offers a window onto a moment when radical white feminists attempted to create a black feminist intersectional praxis. As a founder of the predominantly white radical feminist movement, Kennedy insisted that the struggle live up to its radical title. In short, Kennedy's black feminist story helps us to understand a history of intersectionality. And I'd like to end right there because I'm sure I brought up so many things that people have questions about. So thank you. Thank you.